welcome to Long Skies Gear. This episode is devoted to the Tech 21 Sansamp YYZ Geddy Lee pedal. It's one of a series of Geddy Lee pedals and preamps that they do. This is the sort of the simplest form. And I bought it because I was interested in recording bass, silently recording bass. A few years ago, I used to do, in a similar method that I would to recording guitars, I would put an SM57 in front of a bass amp, record it mono into the interface, and then listen back to the results. And I felt that it never quite captured the sound of a bass amp moving air in that respect. You know, a single microphone wasn't really doing it. And then because at the time, you know, where I was living, it became a little bit antisocial to try and record bass lines late at night and so on. And I looked at doing things, you know, directly and silently. And for a time, I would just take a direct line from the bass guitar into the interface, copy that, add an amp sim, and then I would be running kind of a direct line and an amp sim, combine them, and that was my bass tone. And for quite a time, I used that and I quite liked it. But I also experimented with having a DI box and a separate fuzz pedal, something like a Muff or a Swollen Pickle, because they leave more of the bass intact, and therefore by combining a Swollen Pickle and a DI signal, you have that depth and you have the grit, and that was my favoured route for some time too. But when I saw these YYZ pedals, which have this blending facility, they allow you to, if you're not a particular fan of running an overdriven bass sound, you know, you can effectively turn the drive and the grit off, and you can operate the Geddy Lee pedal as a preamp effectively. And you have the 3-band EQ, you have the bass mid treble, and there's quite an interesting what they call a tight switch that, as the name implies, it tightens up the bass, and I think it's particularly useful when you are overdriving the bass tones, because I think too much low end and low mids combined with fuzz makes things very muddy. I think scooped tones work better with bass, whether you've got the low intact and you've got the high, but you don't want too much middle. I think for that reason, something like a precision bass can be quite tricky to use with fuzz. It can take up a lot of the frequency spectrum in my experience. The Rickenbacker less so. But for the examples that are coming up, what I'm going to do, I'm going to be uniform in that I will be running on the bridge pickup, always on the bridge, and I will be on what they call the vintage pull. So I'll be running it so it's similar to a 4001 bridge pickup, rather than the more modern 4003, which has a little bit more low end. So I'm running on vintage and I'm running on bridge. I'll give a series of examples of playing with my fingers and playing with a plectrum. And what I'll try and do, I'll show some of the things that this pedal can do, some of the things, compare it directly to a DI and a fuzz combination. We can hear that sound. And then I'll just run it in a mix, because sometimes you create these marvellous overdriven sort of fat bass tones, but when you put them in a mix with guitars, drums, synthesizers and so on, there just isn't any room left, and they can be disappointing in that sense, because they can either be buried or they can be too greedy and take up too much of the spectrum, and then you end up having to mix them down or EQ them in software, which sort of defeats the object, I suppose. So I'll have a little bit of look at how these things sit in a mix with guitars and drums. And let's take it from there. we heard for that second example was playing with the plectrum, and I alternated, as the caption showed, between DI, DI plus YYZ. I was taking the different layers in and out, and you could hear the sounds. Often the YYZ in that example was very dirty and very overdriven, but if you blend it in the right proportion with a thicker DI signal, it works quite nicely. It's an emphasis. It adds that top grit and bite. What I'm going to do next, I will play with the plectrum. I'll play the same kind of riffs, same kind of bass lines, but I will use the DI box and the Swollen Pickle, which is quite a muff style, fat, heavy sort of fuzz. So that's next. Now what I'm going to do is stick with the Rickenbacker, stick with the plectrum. I'm not going to have any overdrive at first. I'm just going to use the YYZ as a preamp. Have it clean, just shape the EQ a little bit. You'll hear what the tight button does, and then I will add a little bit of drive, add a little bit of overdrive and grit in there, and we'll hear the sound again. I'll keep the backing instruments quite light so that we're getting maximum bass tone. I think for a little bit of a variety, I'll introduce a five-string bass, and we'll see it's effectively modelled on a jazz, but it has active pickups and that low B, and we'll perhaps hear what adding grit and fuzz does to the lower notes, to the low B. Again, playing on the same track and keeping the backing components lighter to maximise the bass tone. So far from being an exhaustive tour of the YYZ, I'm sure that there are much better videos and there are much more informative demonstrations of that pedal out there. I think it's showing. Some people complain that oh, I don't like fuzz. You know, I've got a Rickenbacker. I like the Rickenbacker tone, as if that it's all or nothing. And what this YYZ does, I think, even if you're not a fan of overdriven sounds, I think in a rock mix, just enables you to add that little bit of shaping, that little bit of top, that little bit of grit that pops out of the mix in the right places. What I'll do now, normally I would have a play out when I'm doing the guitar stuff. I'd have a little sort of play out, fade to black. I can't really do that, but I'll do an extended segment of track with all the layers in, playing the Rickenbacker, playing the combination of a direct line and the YYZ. There'll be all sorts of things going on. There'll be guitars and synthesizers, drums, some soloing and so on, but I will sit underneath that and we'll hopefully hear how this kind of combination bass tone sits in a busy mix. So for this low frequency edition of Long Skies Gear, I will say goodbye for now.